In 1988, Japan controlled half of the world's semiconductor market. 6 of the top 10 chipmakers were Japanese. NEC, Hitachi, and Toshiba sat at the very top, unchallenged, seemingly unstoppable. Then, in what many call the greatest industrial collapse in modern history, Japan's share plummeted from 50% to just 9%. Today, not a single Japanese company ranks among the world's top 10 chipmakers. But now, Japan is making its biggest industrial bet in decades, a $65 billion gamble to reclaim its place at the heart of the global chip industry. 3 massive projects are rising across the country. A Taiwanese giant building a megafab in Kumamoto, a startup in Hokkaido chasing the world's most advanced chips, and an American memory maker expanding in Hiroshima. And here's what most people don't realize: Japan never actually left the game. It just changed the rules it was playing by. Image. Semiconductors have become the most strategically important technology on Earth. They power everything from smartphones and electric vehicles to artificial intelligence systems and advanced military hardware. A single cutting-edge chip factory costs $10 to $20 billion to build and requires equipment so precise that it can etch patterns smaller than a virus. In 2026, governments around the world are spending hundreds of billions of dollars to secure their semiconductor supply chains. The United States passed its $53 billion CHIPS Act. The European Union mobilized €43 billion. China launched its third big fund worth $34 billion. South Korea unveiled a $260 trillion support package. Chart. But Japan's approach stands apart from the rest. While other countries are trying to build semiconductor ecosystems almost from scratch, Japan is doing something far more interesting. It's leveraging hidden strengths that never disappeared, a quiet dominance in equipment and materials that every chipmaker on Earth depends on, to stage what could be the most consequential industrial comeback of the 21st century. In this video, we'll trace Japan's extraordinary journey from semiconductor superpower to also RAN, and examine the 3 mega projects at the heart of its revival strategy. We'll uncover Japan's hidden monopoly in chip-making equipment that gives it leverage no other country possesses. And we'll ask the critical question: can $65 billion buy Japan's way back to the top? Image. To understand Japan's semiconductor comeback, you first need to understand just how dominant it once was. In 1976, Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, known as MITI, launched what became known as the Super LSI project. It was audacious. The government essentially forced 6 fierce corporate rivals, Fujitsu, Hitachi, NEC, Mitsubishi Electric, NTT, and Toshiba, to share their most closely guarded technological secrets in a joint research laboratory in Kanagawa Prefecture. Government funding covered about 40% of the project's costs. The rest came from the companies themselves, motivated partly by patriotism and partly by the understanding that none of them could catch the Americans alone. Image. The results were extraordinary. These companies developed breakthrough techniques in electron beam lithography, and Japanese firms like Nikon and Canon commercialized lithography steppers that became the global industry standard. Japanese manufacturers obsessed over quality control in ways that American companies simply didn't, testing every single chip rather than sampling batches. The reject rates at Japanese fabs were often a fraction of their American competitors. Japan's share of global semiconductor sales rocketed from 15% in the early 1970s to 50% by the mid-1980s, overtaking the United States in a stunning reversal. Chart. By 1986, Japanese companies held 3 of the top 5 positions in global chip rankings. NEC sat at number 1, Hitachi at number 2, Toshiba at number 3. In memory chips, specifically DRAM, the backbone of the computing industry at the time, Japan's dominance was even more extreme. Japanese companies controlled 75% of the global DRAM market, while America's share had collapsed from 70% to just 20% in less than a decade. Japan hadn't just caught up with the United States. It had blown past it. And American industry leaders were terrified. Image. What happened next is one of the most dramatic reversals in industrial history, and it carries uncomfortable parallels with today's technology rivalries between the United States and China. American chipmakers accused Japanese firms of dumping semiconductors below cost to destroy competition. In June 1985, The Semiconductor Industry Association filed a formal trade complaint under Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act. The political pressure was intense. Members of Congress smashed Toshiba products on the Capitol lawn. The rhetoric painted Japan not just as a competitor, but as an existential threat to American technological supremacy. Image. In September 1986, the two governments signed the U.S.-Japan Semiconductor Agreement. Japan agreed to stop selling chips below a minimum price floor and committed to doubling the market share of foreign chip companies within Japan from 10% to 20%. A secret side letter made the 20% target explicit. The agreement was devastating. Overnight, Japan's chipmakers lost their most powerful competitive weapon: the ability to undercut rivals on price. When Washington determined that Tokyo wasn't complying fast enough, the U.S. imposed punitive 100% tariffs on Japanese memory chips in 1987. Douglas Irwin, a leading trade historian, has called the agreement one of the most controversial trade policy actions of the entire decade. Chart. But the trade agreement was only part of the story. The 1985 Plaza Accord had already forced a dramatic appreciation of the yen against the dollar, making Japanese exports far more expensive virtually overnight. To counter the economic drag, Japan's central bank slashed interest rates, fueling the massive real estate and stock market bubble that, when it burst around 1990, plunged the economy into what became known as the lost decades. Corporate investment across every sector dried up. Research and development budgets were slashed. The very companies that had dominated global semiconductors found themselves starved of the capital needed to keep pace with an industry that was reinventing itself. Image. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was transforming the semiconductor business model. South Korea's Samsung and SK Hynix took over the DRAM business that Japan had pioneered, investing aggressively even during downturns. Taiwan created an entirely new paradigm, the pure-play foundry, with Morris Chang founding TSMC in 1987 to manufacture chips designed by other companies. American firms reinvented themselves by specializing. Intel dominated microprocessors, while fabless companies like Qualcomm, Broadcom, and eventually Nvidia designed chips without owning a single factory. Japanese companies, fixated on vertical integration long after the world had moved to horizontal specialization, watched their market share evaporate decade after decade. From 50% in 1988 to 30% by 1998, to 10% by 2019. By Gartner's 2024 rankings, not a single Japanese company appeared among the world's top 10 chipmakers. Image. In 2021, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, the successor to MITI, declared semiconductors a national strategic priority. What followed was the most aggressive industrial policy Japan has pursued since the Super LSI project nearly 5 decades earlier. The numbers are staggering. The Japanese government has committed 10 trillion yen, roughly $65 billion, in subsidies and incentives for semiconductors and artificial intelligence through fiscal year 2030. Starting in fiscal 2026, the industry ministry's budget for chips and AI will nearly quadruple to 1.23 trillion yen. That's $7.9 billion, in a single year. The government's explicit target: triple domestic semiconductor sales from 5 trillion yen in 2020 to 15 trillion yen by 2030. Image. To put this spending in perspective, Japan is investing 0.71% of its entire GDP on semiconductor subsidies. That's more than 3 times the ratio of the United States at 0.21%, and nearly double Germany's 0.41%. No major economy on Earth is betting as heavily on chips relative to its size. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, who took office in October 2025 and won a historic landslide election in February 2026, has doubled down on this strategy. She calls it crisis management investment and has designated semiconductors as one of 17 strategic sectors receiving focused government support under a new growth strategy headquarters. A record national budget was expected by spring 2026, packed with spending on AI, chips, and defense. As a METI director put it bluntly, the era where the world is at peace, and it doesn't matter who supplies our semiconductors, is over. Chart. The first pillar of Japan's strategy is bringing the world's most advanced chipmaker to Japanese soil. TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, fabricates chips for Apple, Nvidia, AMD, and virtually every major technology firm on the planet. It controls over 60% of the global foundry market, and it is now building what could become one of its most important production hubs outside Taiwan, on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. Phase 1 is already operational. Since December 2024, the Kumamoto facility, officially known as JASM, a joint venture majority owned by TSMC with minority stakes from Sony Semiconductor Solutions, Denso, and Toyota, has been producing chips using 12 and 16 nanometer processes. Monthly capacity, 55,000 wafers. Primary products, automotive chips and image sensors. Workforce, 2,400 and growing. Image, but the real story is Phase 2, and how dramatically it escalated. TSMC originally planned to build a second Kumamoto fab producing 6 or 7 nanometer chips, a solid but unremarkable upgrade. Then global demand for AI chips exploded, and the plans were rewritten entirely. In early 2026, TSMC CEO C.C. Wei flew to Tokyo, met with Prime Minister Takaichi, and confirmed that the second Kumamoto plant would produce 3 nanometer chips, the same cutting-edge technology powering the latest iPhones, the most advanced AI accelerators, and next-generation autonomous driving systems. The estimated investment, $17 billion. If TSMC adds advanced packaging capabilities, which is under discussion, Kumamoto could become a global production and assembly hub in the AI era, not just a satellite facility. Image. The impact on Kumamoto Prefecture has already been transformative. While most Japanese regions are shrinking due to the country's demographic crisis, Kumamoto's population has held steady, and semiconductor job creation is a major reason why. The governor of Kumamoto is actively lobbying for a third TSMC fab, though he acknowledges it could take years and depends on the first 2 running efficiently. What's already clear is that TSMC's presence has catalyzed an entire ecosystem. Suppliers are relocating, housing construction has surged, and the region is positioning itself as Japan's semiconductor capital, a silicon island for the 21st century. Chart. If TSMC in Kumamoto represents the safe, proven strategy of importing world-class foreign expertise, Rapidus is something else entirely. It's a moonshot. Founded in August 2022 by a consortium of 8 Japanese corporate giants, Sony, Toyota, NTT, SoftBank, Kioxia, NEC, Denso, and MUFG Bank, Rapidus has set a staggeringly ambitious goal: mass-produce 2 nanometer logic chips by 2027. For context, 2 nanometers is the absolute cutting edge of semiconductor manufacturing. Only TSMC and Samsung began volume production of their own 2 nanometer processes in late 2025. Rapidus would be just the 3rd entity in the world to achieve this, and it's attempting to do it essentially from scratch. Image. The company is led by Atsuyoshi Koike, a veteran semiconductor engineer with more than 40 years of industry experience. Koike previously ran Western Digital's Japanese operations and, 2 decades before that, founded Trecenti Technologies, a Japanese foundry that ultimately failed because it was too tightly tethered to its parent company Hitachi. He sees Rapidus as his second chance, and he's determined not to repeat the same mistakes. The technical progress has been remarkable. Working with IBM, which demonstrated the world's first 2 nanometer chip back in 2021, Rapidus has successfully built working prototypes of 2 nanometer gate all-around transistors at its pilot line in Chitose, Hokkaido. The facility houses Japan's first extreme ultraviolet lithography machine, the most complex instrument ever built, manufactured by the Dutch company ASML and costing roughly $300 million each. Image. By February 2026, Rapidus had released its first process design kit to early access customers and secured 267.6 billion yen in new funding from 32 private companies including Canon, Fujitsu, Sony, SoftBank, and Honda. The total government commitment to Rapidus has reached 920 billion yen. But what makes Rapidus genuinely different, and potentially viable, is its business model. Instead of competing head-to-head with TSMC on massive volume production, Rapidus is betting on speed. Traditional semiconductor fabrication takes up to 120 days from wafer start to completion. Rapidus claims its proprietary single wafer processing system can slash that to just 50 days. Chart. The target customers aren't the Apples and NVIDIAs of the world. They're AI startups, defense contractors, and boutique chip designers who need rapid iteration and are willing to pay a premium for fast turnaround rather than rock-bottom cost per wafer. As one analyst noted, the value proposition of Rapidus is small volumes at fast turnaround time. Being a small fab aligned for large numbers of small batches will help attract companies iterating chip designs fast. But the skeptics have a point. Rapidus is a 4-year-old company with no revenue attempting to match the technical capabilities of firms that have spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars perfecting their processes. It will need an estimated 5 trillion yen in total investment, far more than the 920 billion yen the government has committed so far. And the history of state-backed semiconductor moonshots includes as many expensive failures as successes. Image. Here's the part of the story that most people miss entirely. While Japan lost the chip fabrication race over the past 3 decades, it quietly built, and maintained, an almost unassailable position in the equipment and materials that every single chip maker in the world depends on. This is Japan's hidden moat, and it may be the single most important factor in the entire comeback strategy. Consider these numbers. Tokyo Electron and Screen Holdings together control 88% of the global market for coder and developer equipment, machines that are absolutely essential to the lithography process at the heart of chipmaking. Advantest holds 58% of the semiconductor testing equipment market. Overall, Japanese companies command 56% of the global semiconductor materials market and 32% of the equipment market. Chart. Dig deeper and the picture becomes even more striking. Shin-Etsu Chemical and Sumco together produce more than half the world's silicon wafers, the foundational substrate on which every chip is built. Japanese firms dominate photoresists, the light-sensitive chemicals essential for printing circuit patterns onto silicon, controlling roughly 50% of the global supply. These aren't commodities that can be easily replaced. They require decades of accumulated expertise in precision chemistry and materials science. Tokyo Electron alone holds more than 22,000 patents and has committed 1.5 trillion yen in R&D spending over 5 years through fiscal 2029. Its equipment is indispensable for producing chips at 5 nanometers and below, meaning that every advanced fab in the world, whether it belongs to TSMC, Samsung, or Intel, relies on Tokyo Electron machines. Image. This isn't a minor footnote. It's a strategic choke point with real geopolitical implications. When Japan restricted exports of certain semiconductor materials to South Korea in 2019 during a diplomatic dispute, it sent shockwaves through the Korean chip industry, a stark reminder of who actually controls the bottlenecks in the global supply chain. And then there's Sony Semiconductor Solutions, which controls nearly 50% of the global CMOS image sensor market. These tiny sensors are inside virtually every smartphone camera, every autonomous vehicle's perception system, and an increasing number of industrial robots and security cameras. Sony's dominance in image sensors is arguably more complete than any other company's position in any other semiconductor segment. So while Japan may have lost the headlines about who makes the fastest processors, it never lost control of the fundamental building blocks that make those processors possible. Image. Despite these strengths, Japan's semiconductor strategy faces 3 major obstacles that could derail even the most well-funded plans. The first, and potentially most crippling, is talent. Japan projects a shortage of 220,000 IT professionals by 2026. Experienced semiconductor engineers have left for better-paying positions in Taiwan, South Korea, China, and the United States. Japan's declining birth rate means the domestic talent pool is shrinking every year. The working-age population falls further with each passing quarter. Globally, the semiconductor industry will need 1 million additional skilled workers by 2030, according to SEMI, but the pipeline of trained graduates falls far short of demand. Chart. Japan is responding on multiple fronts. Universities are developing new semiconductor-focused curricula. Regional training consortia have been established near the new fab sites. Visa processing has been accelerated for foreign engineers, and the foreign workforce in Japan hit a record 2.3 million in 2024. But every country building new fabs is chasing the same limited pool of global expertise, and Japan's relatively lower salaries and language barriers make it a harder sell than Silicon Valley or Hsinchu. The second challenge is the technology gap. Japan's current domestic fabrication capability sits at roughly 40 nanometers, a generation behind the cutting edge. TSMC brings 3 nanometer expertise to Kumamoto, and Rapidus is working with IBM on 2 nanometer. But there's a legitimate question about whether Japan can truly close a gap that took 3 decades to open. The third risk is execution itself. Rapidus needs 5 trillion yen total. It has roughly 1 trillion so far. Its single wafer processing approach is innovative but commercially unproven at scale. Image. And then there's the geopolitical wildcard. The US-China technology war has been a tailwind for Japan so far, driving companies like TSMC to diversify production outside of Taiwan. But escalating trade tensions create new risks for Japanese companies that sell equipment to Chinese chipmakers. Tokyo Electron, for instance, generated 43% of its revenue from China in late 2023. If export controls tighten further, which is likely, some of Japan's most profitable equipment companies could see a significant revenue hit. The lesson of the 1986 trade agreement haunts Japan's semiconductor establishment. What geopolitics gives, geopolitics can take away. Image. Japan's $65 billion semiconductor bet is not really about returning to the 1980s. No one expects Japan to regain 50% of the global chip market, and that's not the goal. The strategy is far more sophisticated than that. Japan is positioning itself as the indispensable foundation of the global chip supply chain, not necessarily the biggest chip producer, but the country that no one can build advanced chips without. The TSMC Megafab in Kumamoto brings world-class foundry manufacturing to Japanese soil. Rapidus in Hokkaido pursues the cutting edge of logic chips with a differentiated business model. Micron's $9.6 billion expansion in Hiroshima strengthens high-bandwidth memory production for AI. And the hidden moat of equipment and materials companies, Tokyo Electron, Shin-Etsu, Screen, Advantest, Sony, ensures that Japan remains embedded at the center of the global semiconductor industry regardless of who ultimately fabricates the most chips. Image. Whether Rapidus succeeds or stumbles, whether TSMC's Kumamoto operation expands to 3 fabs or stops at 2. The fundamental bet Japan is making is that in an era of technological competition and geopolitical fragmentation, no serious country can afford to be dependent on others for its semiconductors. Japan tried that once, after the trade wars of the 1980s, and it led to 3 decades of marginalization. This time, with its unique combination of equipment monopolies, materials dominance, a committed government, and now world-class fab partners on its soil, Japan may be better positioned for the new semiconductor era than anyone gives it credit for. The era where it didn't matter who made the chips is indeed over. And Japan is making very sure it won't be left behind again. Image. If you found this deep dive valuable, subscribe to the Japan Playbook and turn on notifications. We publish new analyses of Japanese business, technology, and strategy every week. What do you think? Can Japan pull off this semiconductor comeback, or is $65 billion not enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.